Very happy to welcome Abhilasha Kumar. Abhilasha worked mostly as an information researcher. She got a PhD at Washington University, St. Louis, with a result. And she worked for a while in Indiana with Mike Johnson, and then he has a associate professor,
assistant
professor at Logan College in Maine. Part of a great place.
Yes, that's the picture of Maine. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Starting from Maine, you can see that methodologically comes from a tradition that is quite close to the lab ones, and also thematically, I think she's doing something that is very interesting about she's working topics that are in the intersection between language, memory, reasoning, and also social interaction. That part is not so much represented in the lab.
Yet.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so looking forward to hear from her. Very interesting. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco. Hi, everyone. It's been really nice. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed talking with some of you today, and I'm excited to share some of what we've been working on in my lab. So in my lab, like Marco said, we're broadly interested in fundamental questions about language, as is everyone in this room probably. So to narrow that down a little bit, today I'll be talking about two arms of my research. One of them focuses on how we search through memory, and specifically on mechanisms underlying lexical retrieval as you're engaging in memory search. And then the second part of my talk will focus on this newer line of work that I've started thinking about novel word learning, which also connects to several themes in the lab. So starting with this first part, the reason that I got interested in memory search is because we do it all the time. So, you know, we are always searching for items from our mental lexicon, whether you're coming up with, whether you were telling me about your favorite restaurants in Milan, or you're going grocery shopping and trying to make a list, you're packing items for a trip, which is what I did before I came on this trip. We're doing this all the time, right? We're searching for things that we need at a given moment of time. And often this task is relatively effortless, but I'm interested in what are the mechanisms that underlie this seemingly effortless task of search. And typically in the lab, this is studied using the verbal fluency task, which is also part of many neuropsychological testing batteries to test for or can be diagnostic of things like dementia, schizophrenia, other naming deficits. So how many of you are aware of what the verbal fluency task is? Most people are aware. Okay, so we're not going to have you do it, which is usually what I try to do. But as most of you know already, typically in the verbal fluency task, you're asked to list as many items from a given category. That category can be semantic, so something like animals, or it could be phonemic, so you could be given a letter and you have to start with that. So I'm more interested in the semantic fluency task, so that's what we'll be focusing on today. And there's been, you know, many decades of research on exactly what people are doing when they search through memory in this kind of task. And one of the things that has come up in this like behavioral pattern of work that people have done is that we know that people produce items in clusters. And so, for example, if someone produced these 4 items, 4 animals, so owl, eagle, eel, and platypus, you could look at this list and say owl and eagle are birds, so they're part of one cluster, and then eel and platypus are both squishy, gross creatures, so maybe they're part of another cluster, right? So a cluster is a group of consecutively related items, and then your transition from one cluster to another is typically defined as a switch. So you're switching from one cluster to another. in this case, from the bird cluster to the gross squishy creature cluster, right? And then why we care about these things is because looking at how many items people produce in the verbal fluency task, but also, you know, what kinds of clusters they make and how many clusters they make is diagnostic of several different kinds of cognitive impairments and can also be a good indicator of individual differences. And so what I've been really interested in is thinking about these kinds of patterns of search, but situating them in a more sort of integrated theory of lexical search. So what do I mean by that? So my sort of early graduate training focused on understanding how semantic and phonological information interacts in the context of lexical retrieval. So I was doing a lot of like priming-based work, where we were looking at how younger and older adults respond to semantic and phonological information. And we find that both age groups would benefit from phonological information. So that's sort of where I was learning how these sources are interacting in that context. And as I started sort of reading more and learning more, there's been more and more work, some from this lab, that has been showing that you know, the word form and the meaning of the word tend to be more correlated than you would typically expect across many languages, right? So this is one study that looked at the correlation between the form of a word and the semantic similarity between the meaning of the word. And you find meaningful, small, non-zero correlations across many languages. So Italian is right up there. English is right down there, but it's still non-zero. So I want to point out all of my work is still speaking to that non-zero correlation. But more generally, these systematic form-to-meaning mappings are being increasingly talked about. And so one of the things I've been interested in is thinking about, well, how does that feature when you're doing something like memory search, right? Which is a semantic task, but when these sources are correlated, how do we make use of that? Do we make use of that? How does that all come together? And the other question that I've been really interested in is what exactly do we mean when I'm saying cluster, right? I sort of randomly put circles and lines on this transition, right? And I told you these two items were part of one cluster and the other two were part of another cluster. Turns out this question is actually non-trivial. And there's been a lot of work to try to figure out how people define what exactly belongs in a cluster, right? So what does it mean when two items are consecutively related? How can we map that concept of relatedness to something a little bit more quantifiable? So the past couple of years, I've been really interested in thinking about this question of how words may be related. And when you're thinking about the verbal fluency task, the semantic one, especially, it's a semantic task. So not surprisingly, you would expect semantic similarity to be important in this task. And there are many ways to quantify semantic similarity. One popular approach, as we know, is thinking about how these items are projected in a high dimensional space. And so you can look at distributional cosine similarity as an index of semantic similarity between the words, right? So for example, if you're thinking about the transition from owl to eagle and then eagle to eel, you can look at the cosine similarity between owl and eagle and see that it is more semantically related than eagle to eel. And that might give you some indication that they're part of the same cluster, right? So another way that you might think about, given all this information about how form and meaning might be correlated, is thinking about phonological similarity. And so is it the case that there is an overlap in the phonemes that make up these words, right? So what you can do is you can break down every possible word a participant might produce into its constituent phonemes, and then look at the distance between those phonemes to get an index of phonological similarity, right? And so here you see that eagle and eel are more phonologically related than owl and eagle, right? Another common lexical source that people tend to use when you are producing items in the verbal fluency task is word frequency. So the more common an item is in natural language, the more easily it comes to mind. So you're less likely to produce something like platypus as the first item. You're more likely to say something like cat or dog, right? And so you can also look at that particular lexical source, try to quantify that as well, right? So this is all fine, but then you have to ask the question of which of these lexical sources actually feature in memory search, right? And so this data comes from a study conducted by my collaborator, Nancy Lundeen, who did all the hard work of conducting the verbal fluency task in the fMRI scanner. So thankfully, I was just able to use the data, which was great. But what they did was people did the verbal fluency task in the scanner, then they came out of the scanner and they were asked to group items and tell the experimenter how they clustered their search, right? So at the end of that, what we have are participant-provided designations of what belongs in a cluster and what doesn't belong in a cluster, okay? And over here, I'm showing you the semantic similarity of items that were designated as part of a cluster versus items designated as non-clusters, right? And as you would expect, items within a cluster were rated, items that were rated as within a cluster had higher semantic similarity than switch items, right? You see almost a very small effect. The data set is small here. It's 30 participants, so we don't have a lot of data here. But if anything, it looks like items that were part of switch transitions had slightly higher word frequency. So when you're switching from one cluster to another, you're trying to look for a cue that will like easily be accessible to you, which kind of makes sense. And surprisingly, what we see is we see a very similar pattern to semantic similarity when you look at phonological similarity. So items that were designated as part of the same cluster also had higher phonological similarity compared to switch items, right? So that's kind of interesting. And so we started thinking about how much hard work went into doing this study and thinking about how can we automate this process of designating clusters and switches so that it's a little bit easier when you're looking at clinical data and all of these other kinds of data sets where this can be diagnostic, right? So consider this particular fluency list. What you can do, what we've done recently is we've looked at combining some of these sources to define a new method of establishing what belongs in a cluster versus a switch. You can look at the semantic similarity across each transition, as well as the phonological similarity, and you can look at word frequency. And what we find is that a method that combines semantic and phonological similarity to define clusters turns out to be the most predictive of these participant designations of clusters and switches. So we find that this is true for different domains. So thinking about animals, food, and occupations, we see that this multimodal delta method is what we're calling it. It's only two modes, semantic and phonological information. But it tends to perform really well in terms of explaining variance in this task, especially when there are domains where you don't have openly available norms, which is often the case when you go beyond animals. So using all this information, we've also started thinking about a process model for exactly how people are navigating their lexicon. And one sort of popular account is this of foraging, which is the idea that just as animals are foraging in the wild for resources, so a bee is going from one bush to another, and at some point they have to make a decision about, have I exploited this bush enough before I move on? The same mechanisms also apply to internal search. And so the idea is that local transitions are relying on fast and automatic retrieval processes that are often using semantic and phonological information. And when you have to make a decision to move to a new cluster, this is a more effortful strategic retrieval process that often relies on frequency. And sometimes some of our work shows that people also use phonology to some extent to make that next move. So this is all interesting, but the question remains about why are people using phonology, right? This is a semantic task. There's no need to use phonology. And so one pattern that we started to notice is that as you use more phonological similarity, you produce more items, right? So it's surprising that it's a cue that's not relevant technically to the task, but once you start to use it, you tend to produce more and more items in the task. And you also tend to use the cue more as you go further down the list. So it's almost like when you're running out of items that you could produce solely using semantic similarity is when you start leveraging this additional cue. And some of this has also been suggested as an account for how people produce free associations. And so here, the idea that authors have sort of suggested, looking at some of what we've been doing, is also that when you are in semantically dense neighborhoods, when you're in dense neighborhoods, the use of phonology is not so frequent. But when you are in sparser semantic neighborhoods is when you start leveraging this addition. So it may be adaptive to some extent. More recently, we've become interested in scaling up this work a little bit. So we have two goals. One is methodological, to sort of collect and publish a very large data set of verbal fluency, but also theoretically to go beyond the category of animals, and more importantly, to go beyond the category of taxonomic categories, right? So often, so the examples that I gave at the start of the talk, going grocery shopping or listing your favorite restaurants, these are not well-formed, well-learned categories. These are categories that we're making up on the fly, that we're engaging in search for. So we've become interested in thinking about how does search actually happen in these more naturalistic, more ecologically valid categories. So we've collected a very large data set. We're writing this up as my postdoc is writing this up as we speak, where we have fluency data from these 6 categories from over 1,200 people. And right off the bat, we do see some baseline differences in just how many items people produce in the task. So people aren't producing as many animals, as many items as they produce in the animals category relative to some other category like excuses or items you rescued from a burning home, right? And then what we start to notice is that there are actually differences in the structure or the topology of these categories. So these are some preliminary network analyses of the responses that people produce. And ASPL stands for average shortest path length, which means how easy is it to get from one item to another in this network. And clustering coefficient captures how clumpy or patchy that space is, right? And so what you notice is that some spaces are very highly clustered. So something like animals, items on a beach, right? You may be thinking about things on a beach might be just like animals that are in the sea or ocean versus like things you need to go for a beach vacation or something like that, and that might result in clumpiness. But then you have something like excuses, which is not clumpy at all, right? And it has a very high path length as well, which suggests that this category is less structured and harder to navigate than a well-formed category like animals. So just an example, this is what the animals network looks like. Bar a few random strands, you'll see that most of it is very, very densely connected, right? This is very different from the excuses category, where you see a lot of these branches, right? So there's still a core, but a lot of different branches that a potential person could take. My favorite excuse is just because. I'm late because there's no reason for you to be asking me that. Yeah. So we've also been interested in looking at, okay, well, what about all these different lexical sources that we typically see people are using in this task, right? Does that also vary now because of the topology of the space, because of how people have to navigate this space? And for semantic similarity, we see that more or higher semantic similarity the use of higher semantic similarity is related to a higher fluency score. Are we okay? Okay. And we also see for more structured categories, the use of phonological similarity is also related to a higher fluency score and lower word frequency. You need to come up with more atypical items to be able to produce more items. However, as you can see, not all categories are the same, right? So you do see structural differences manifest in overall use of lexical sources. So excuses and burning home don't really function the same way. You might be noticing classroom is doing something totally weird too. I'm happy to talk about that after. But the more structured categories with higher clustering and higher shorter path lengths are the ones that seem to, again, go together and have the same kind of lexical source use. We also see the same kind of pattern where using higher phonological similarity and lower semantic similarity and word frequency is associated with is associated with later in the task, right? So as you run out of items, you want items that are higher in phonological similarity, but lower in frequency and semantic similarity, likely because you run out of those easier items, right? So kind of the bigger point here is that the structure of the space is guiding your processing of these items and how you navigate this space in conjunction with these lexical sources, right? So you have an additional constraint depending on how easy to navigate a particular category is. Another piece of this work is we've been looking at some group level comparisons because there always appear to be vast differences in how atypical versus typical populations perform in the verbal fluency task. So over here, I have a graph, which is just showing the verbal fluency score for a population of normal hearing individuals, as well as individuals who grew up prelingually deaf and then later got cochlear implants. So we're seeing that they produce fewer items, right? This is a pattern we often see in clinical data. The question is why, right? So there's been some work that has suggested that the reason individuals with cochlear implant produce fewer items in verbal fluency is because there are differences in their semantic organization, right? But could it also be that there are differences in how they process this information, or is it a combination of both, right? So the way that we've been getting at this issue is by modeling both the representation and the process level. So at the representational level, we've been considering the blend of two different kinds of models. They're both trained on the same data from Wikipedia, but one of them is trained on the text from Wikipedia, and speech-to-vec is trained on the speech, the acoustic signal. So they're both picking up regularities, but from different modalities, right? And what we're looking at is a blended lexical representation. And we can then look at which of these sources is more highlighted when you're performing a search task, and does that vary across the two populations? And then we can combine the embeddings that we get from these blended representations with our process models for foraging. So thinking about our methods for defining clusters and switches, and then thinking about within and between cluster transitions, and looking at how do these sources actually play out when the search is happening. So this is a bit of a complex graph, but essentially what I'm showing you here is what is the weight on the speech-to-vec acoustic representation in the best fitting model for each participant. And one of the reasons we looked at the best fitting model is because there's a lot of heterogeneity in our data, especially in the cochlear implant group. So we didn't want to go with like a group level model or any kind of model that kind of takes away the heterogeneity. And so what you'll see are what proportion of the participants were amplifying different levels of acoustic representations in their search, okay? And so on the left, I have animals, which is the standard domain. And here's what we see. So there's not a big difference between the normal hearing and the cochlear implant group. They sort of show a similar pattern where some people are almost never prioritizing the acoustic representation and entirely relying on the text-based representation, whereas others are on the other end. Here we see the cochlear implant users slightly emphasize the speech-based representation, but this turns to be a lot higher when you think about a different domain, like food. And one of the reasons that we thought this was interesting is because in foods, semantic and phonological similarity are more correlated than they are in animals. And so in a domain or a category where these sources are more correlated, it seems that cochlear implant users are globally amplifying the speech-related information, okay? This is quite surprising. This is not the hypothesis we went in with. We thought it would be the opposite, actually. And so we're still working through what that actually means, especially when you think about what is happening at the process level. So now looking at not just what's the best fitting structural model, but what do they do when they're in the task in terms of using these lexical sources. So here the data are split by the phonological similarity as a function of whether it is items part of a cluster versus items that are part of a switch, and how many items people are producing. And so in the normal hearing group, we see that using phonological similarity to retrieve items within a cluster is associated with higher performance. So if you're in a cluster, using semantic similarity is good, but if you leverage phonological similarity, that gives you bonus points, and you can retrieve more items in that cluster. That helps you. Turns out our cochlear implant group is not differentiating the same way, right? And so even though they're globally amplifying the speech-based information, they're not efficiently using phonology in the task. And so one hypothesis we have is that their lexical representation itself is quite impoverished. So even though that source is amplified, when they actually go to generate items, it's not something that they can automatically latch onto the way that a normal hearing individual would. Okay, so I just want to summarize some key takeaways from this part of the talk, and then I'll shift gears. So what I've shown you today is some work suggesting that clustering and memory search is a result of interactions between multiple lexical sources, and that memory search is an adaptive process that requires that you navigate this multimodal lexicon with different levels of clustering. So being sensitive to the structure of the space is as important as being able to navigate that structure in an adaptive way. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit to this other line of work where we've been looking at how people learn new words, right? So people are in this group. I don't need to tell you that this is a very interesting scientific problem, how people learn new words. So children and adults were learning a lot of new words all the time. And there's been decades of work on exactly how this happens. One prominent proposal is that people are attending to statistical regularity. So goes by many names, but distributional hypothesis, you shall know a word by the company it keeps, et cetera, et cetera. So one question that hasn't received as much attention, but is starting to, is this idea of that words are learned incrementally, right? So it is not the case that all of a sudden I just have this explosion of a vocabulary. I'm learning and integrating each word into a pre-existing lexicon. And how is it that I'm doing that? So once I've learned a relatively stable collection of words, now you introduce a new word. Where does that new word go in my lexicon? And this process has recently been referred to as semantic integration. So one proposal for how semantic integration happens is this idea of attending again to these statistical co-occurrences in natural language. So This is work from Olivera Savic and colleagues, who I believe was visiting a few months ago. So some of this might be familiar. So in their study, they exposed participants to a series of sentences where a novel word co-occurred with a known target word. So I love a Fugly apple. I would like to have a Fugly nip. And there were two different kinds of connections. Direct, so the connection between Fugly and apple and Fugly and mip. But even though apple and mip never co-occur, you might still infer that there is an indirect relationship between the two, right? And you can test whether people have successfully integrated these associations into their lexicon using a semantic priming experiment where you present the novel word, which could be directly or indirectly co-occurring with the target word. And what you see is a significant priming effect across many different kinds of manipulations. And one idea that has been sort of proposed that is related to some of this work is the idea of this complementary learning systems account, which is the idea that when novel words are learned, it is an episodic event, right? And so that is being taken care of or being mediated by the hippocampus, and our stable representations are coming from a different system in the neocortex, and only after a period of consolidation or some just waiting period do these representations eventually transfer to this more stable system. And so the question then becomes, well, what is happening in that brief period when these representations haven't fully been transferred, right? What exactly is the strength of these newly formed associations, and how do they compare to pre-existing associations? So this started as a class project. I was teaching a class on methods in cognitive science, and this was a perfect study to, introduce to students the idea of language in a way that was interesting to me as well. And then they were kind of coming up with conceptual replications and extensions. And so the first kind of extension that we thought of was comparing the novel word association with a pre-existing association. So I love a Fugly apple compared to I love a caramelizing apple. Or so one of them is a novel, one of them is pre-existing. Similarly, I love a dotish horse relative to I love a galloping horse. So the expectation is that both of these words should prime the target word, right? The question is, what is the size of that priming effect, and is it different? And what we find is that we do find a significant priming effect for both conditions, and we also find a significant interaction, meaning that the priming effect is stronger for, well, depending on how you interpret it. We find that when you're thinking about something like Fugly as a related prime, the amount of facilitation you get actually is lesser than what you would get from a pre-existing associate like caramelizing, right? And so here the idea is that these newly formed associations are successfully priming the target word, but they're still not as strong as these pre-existing associations. So again, going back to this idea that these associations may be weaker and may require a period of consolidation or more exposure or any of those things for them to be comparable to the pre-existing lexicon. So the question then is, how do we strengthen these these newly learned associations? So this is where we've been looking at how word form similarity could be useful in strengthening these novel word associations. So the next set of studies are fairly simplistic manipulations, but they do give you some kind of starting point to start thinking about these in natural language. So in the first follow-up we manipulated whether the novel word had any kind of rhyming-based relationship with the existing target word. So again, it's a very simple manipulation. It's almost a too obvious kind of manipulation, but the expectation was that if you are presenting a rhyming-based association, you would find a significant priming effect. I also want to highlight that this is like I love a Zoc-Roc is very, very artificial, but we do have several of these adjective noun pairings that share the first few syllables, very commonly in other languages as well. So it's not that out of the world. But interestingly, we actually don't find any priming effect in the non-rhyming condition, which was supposed to be just like a conceptual replication of the original work. Not really sure why. Maybe it's because we chose a different target word, which is not as concrete. But we do see a facilitation-based effect from the rhyming condition. Now, to also think about what would happen if the relationship was less obvious, we've also looked at priming only indirect associations that are not so easy to pick up. So in one version or condition, we use the original stimuli. So I love a Fugly apple. I would like to have a Fugly mip. And then in another condition, keeping the semantic category consistent, we manipulated whether or not there's a alliterative relationship between the nouns, right? So melon and mip now start with the same letter. It's not as obvious as the Zakharov type of manipulation. It's also not a direct co-occurrence, right? So it's unclear whether we would see the effect or the benefit of this kind of relationship. And turns out we do. So in the alliterative condition, we actually see a significant priming effect, regardless of whether it's a direct relationship or an indirect relationship. We don't see the significant priming effect in the indirect condition when you're just looking at the original stimuli. So some differences from the original study, but the broader point that I want to make here is that word form similarity can facilitate semantic integration. Now, obviously, we can do more finer experiments and kind of tease this out a little bit, but this is sort of just like preliminary work showing that this is something that can exhilarate semantic integration of novel words. But what really bugged me until this point is that we couldn't really get at what exactly people were learning in the task, right? So coming from where I come from, I want to know, did people understand the meaning of the word Fugly, right? Beyond what they learn about what it is associated with. So for example, you're reading a book and you read these two words, the rambunctious puppy knocked over a lamp, the children burst through the doors, full of rambunctious joy. How many people have heard of the word rambunctious before? Okay, so don't talk. What does rambunctious mean? What do you understand about the word rambunctious from these two words? Any thoughts?
Super energetic.
Super energetic. Yeah, so you might get something from just like the context words, right? So beyond just learning that rambunctious is associated with puppy and it's associated with joy, and puppy and joy are associated with each other, you are extracting more from just these sentences, right? There's a positive association that you've formed between rambunctious and other words as well, right? So I was really interested in actually like diving deeper into that aspect. So I started looking at the sentences from the original study. And just to get a sense of like, well, what are the ways in which they could have learned anything from these sentences, right? So over here, you're seeing kind of a mix of sentences. And what I started looking at is the sentiment score or the valence of the sentence, right? And so we were using a language model to do this. And you can classify every sentence on a scale of -1 to 1, being negative versus positive, right? And so here you're seeing some positive, some negative valence sentences. But as it turns out, most of the sentences in the original study were on the positive side. There were a few exceptions, which I have here in the table, that were negative, but most of them were positive. So one hypothesis we had was that beyond learning that dotish and horse go together, maybe people have a positive representation of dotish, right? And so what we did is we tried to get at implicit and explicit ways of understanding their conception of these novel words. So after finishing the training phase of reading a bunch of these sentences, we asked them to generate sentences using these novel words. We also asked them to generate sentences using real words just to make sure they were paying attention. And then we also conducted an implicit association task where we paired on congruent trials the novel word with positive words, and on incongruent trials, the novel word was paired with negative words, right? To test whether there is a positive association that these words have developed. Looking at the sentences that participants produce, so they're producing all these different kinds of sentences. We then looked at a qualitative response coding method to classify these into different categories. So if they just simply reproduce the original association, so they learned that dotish and horse go together, and they say, I hope to see a dotish horse, that's just an original association. But sometimes they say things like, a dotish hen flew away, or I have a dotish cat, meaning that they have gone beyond horse and extended it to other animals. So we classify that as a new animal association. You could also see similar food-based associations. So foobly sandwich, foobly orange, relative to foobly apple, which was learned. And then sometimes they generalize to other objects, right? So dotish tree, foobly car, these are objects that are not in the same semantic category that was ever presented. And so we're looking at, do these associations, how prevalent are they? What kinds of associations are they? Are they systematic? And sometimes they don't even produce an association. So I have a GEC of my own. We don't know what they learned, if anything, about the word GEC in that case. So when we look at the results from the implicit association task, we see that the novel words do have a positive congruent bias, right? But it turns out that even words that were never presented to the participant also show the same positive bias. So it's unclear whether they've just overextended the positive bias or they would have had that positive bias to begin with. So sort of mixed findings there. When we look at explicit associations, what you're looking at here is the percentage of responses as a function of what type of association was produced, as well as in which context was the novel word learned. So overall, as you can see, most of the time, 70% of the time, people were just producing the original association. So foobly apple, dotish horse, right? So they're not going beyond what they learned. The interesting part here is that when they learn foobly in the context of apple, 5% of the times, well, almost 5% of the times, they do produce a new food association, which they never produce if they learn the word in the context of horse. And similarly, they produce new animal associations in the context of horse more often than they produce in the context of apple. So these numbers are really low, so it's hard to make very confident inferences from here. So you could look at the sentiment as well. If they have extracted anything positive about these novel words, maybe we will see a positive sentiment in the sentences that they produced, right? Turns out that also isn't super reliable. Only the original associations, and weirdly, the inconclusive ones, which don't have any association, are the only ones that have any positive valence. Everything else is not very clear. So I would say moderate, almost little to no evidence for generalization of meaning. So they're not learning as clearly as we would have hoped. But maybe this has something to do with some of these very negative items that are in the training set, right? So most of the sentences are, I also love to have a foobly mip. But then you also have things like, my sister doesn't like to have a foobly apple. So you're confusing the person about, is foobly a good thing or a bad thing, right? And so in our follow-up, we more systematically manipulated valence to have a clear association of which novel word is associated with which valence condition. One thing we did is we collapsed across which kind of word they were learning. So foobly was learned in the context of both apple and horse. Something to do in a future study would be to separate that as well. But this is what we ended up going with. And we normed these sentences. So these are sentiment scores for the stimuli. And you see that they clearly are along the axes we would expect. Positive sentences have positive scores, negative sentences have negative scores. We can do the same when we ask people to produce their own sentences in this study and look at what is the sentiment of the sentences that participants produced. Remember, in the previous study, there wasn't really an inconsistent pattern. Here, we almost reproduced the training stimuli. So participants get it. They get that foobly is a positive word, negative, dotish is a negative word, etc. So that's great. It's kind of like a sanity check that it's working. But the more interesting piece is the kind of associations that they're coming up with. So remember in experiment 3A, the previous one, 70% of the time, they're just producing what they learned, right? And maybe there's something systematic going on with the new animal, new food, but very low percentages. This dramatically changes in this one. So what we see is 50% of the time, they still produce the original association. But now we're seeing a lot more new animal and new food, and also more new object associations. And one of the reasons we think this is happening is because we collapsed across the apple and horse learning context. So now they're inferring that this is an adjective that can be used across many different categories, right? So I had a lovely day. This is a lovely dog. You have a lovely phone. That is the kind of inference that these novel words are affording for our participants, because they're extending it to many more novel objects than you would expect. And these associations also consistently show the expected sentiment based on the training condition that they were in, right? So depending on what kind of association, but also what context they were learned in, they seem to follow that same sentiment pattern. So here we're seeing much stronger evidence for meaning generalization for novel words. And so taken together, this seems to suggest that valence-based information within the distributional statistics of the language can actually enable generalization of novel word meaning, as long as it is consistent and more systematic than you would expect, right? So sort of taking away from this part of the talk, some of the work that I'm showing you suggests that word learning is a highly dynamic sort of process where you have lexical and non-lexical sources that interact with each other. And more broadly, we see this interaction of form and meaning and valence to contribute to this sort of multimodal learning of novel words. So broad takeaways, we started with 2 arms of my work, thinking about memory search and novel word learning. And so across both, what I've tried to highlight is how lexical interactions appear to influence both retrieval as well as production, and how multimodal mechanisms are likely influencing how new words are learned. Okay, so I'll stop here. Just thanking all my mentors and collaborators and students who have worked with me on this project, and NSF for some of the money they gave us. Well, a lot of money, but only for the first part. Thank you. Yeah.
Question. First, thank you for the fantastic talk. I have a few questions, especially regarding the position of novel words, how context affects the learning of novel words. But first, I have a question about the task in which you use the rhyming and non-rhyming words. Because for example, you use as example fubli and zog.
Yeah.
But fubli could be take into account the morphology complexity. So the fubli has a suffix.
Yeah, the L1. Yeah.
So could that affect your results?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I don't know if, I think part of Oliveira's original work might have looked at different stems, but they were still, I think, they weren't words, because this is an adjective, I think they ended up using these like stems that were meaningful. But I think it's a good point that if they were completely not, you know.
I guess that using suffixes that generate adjectives might reduce the possibilities in terms of novel words that one can use. So just curious about if you control that.
Yeah, no, we didn't, but that's a good point. But I've also been thinking about just like the nouns, right? So we focused a lot on like the words themselves. And one of the things we haven't really done in this work, or even looked at separately, is what do people learn about fubli versus what do people learn about mip as the target noun. as opposed to the adjective. And maybe there are differences there too. So that would be something to consider. Yeah.
And I have a follow-up to that because you stole my question. I mean, the general point I was wondering is this is rhyming. So there is a kind of an invitation to focus on the ending.
Yeah.
And in English, the ending is what you find suffix that changes grammatical class.
Mm.
So you might might create a sort of might hurt more than help because especially in the direct connection, you're suggesting with the same ending two different grammatical classes.
Ah, I see.
Adjective and noun.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And it's weird because actually when we made the manipulation, let's see if I can go back to this. So actually the Zoc example doesn't actually have that same morphological, so we didn't control for that very well. Yeah, so that might be something to look at. But you're also, you're thinking about like the pointing to two different.
Linguistic, it's used to find cues for grammatical classes.
Yes. Yes.
So you have two grammatical classes, arguably the same.
Yeah. Yeah, but what is? But what's puzzling is we still find the priming effect in that condition, but not in the original. So that is really weird to us. And I'm not sure why why that happened. Yeah. So, yeah.
Can I go on? Also, in the sentence generation task, do you observe any form of systematicity in terms of phonemes related to positive and negative novel words?
In the participant data or in the?
No, in the
stimuli.
Generated stimuli from participants, yes.
I have not looked at that, but what do you mean? Do you mean, so like when they generate associations like this, are there any
interesting? Some, because, no, maybe I'm not remembering correctly the task, but because I expect that some phonemes related to associated sentences or novel words might carry some emotional balance information. And I was wondering if you observed something similar in your data.
Yeah, I mean, I have not looked at it, and from that lens, I'm not sure. We should talk after because maybe there's a way that we can parse these data that I haven't thought of. But yes, yeah, especially in the one where we manipulate valence, there might be something interesting going on. Yeah.
One last question, if I may. Also, a lot of categories, most of the categories that you use and show that are actually used in this kind of studies are concrete objects. It's with the only exception that were excuses.
Yeah.
Do you expect to find something different if you use abstract concept, considering the relation with language?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, our work on semanticories suggests that those categories don't follow the same kind of navigational strategies, and I would expect other behavioral patterns are also different. So even in this work, it would be interesting to see if like the target noun was more abstract. So I love a dotish, I don't even know, day. Is very different from I love a dotish horse, right? So, and I don't know if there's been enough work looking at the interaction of statistical co-occurrence with concreteness as much in this domain. So I would expect that the patterns will be different. Yeah.
And maybe just a suggestion, but it could be even that using abstract target words might trigger even more stronger emotional balance in the end.
Yes,
so,
absolutely. Yeah. So that's another possibility for sure. Yeah. Hi.
So thank you for your presentation because wonderful, and I have there are more curiosity about your study with the cochlear implant user. So they were adults, right?
The cochlear implant. Sorry, what's your question?
I mean, were they adults? Yes.
They were adolescents, so they had. So I don't have the demographic, which I really should.
That was my curiosity about
Yes.
when they got cochlear implants.
So I think the average age of implantation was relatively early, but when they were tested was, I think, like adolescent to like adult, I would say. So it's a fairly old data set, but they were implanted relatively early, and you still see these deficits. Yeah.
Okay. And you don't know if there is a difference related to the year of implantation?
Yeah, because our sample's so small, we haven't really been able to do any individual difference. Yeah, we should all talk and compile this big database. Yeah, so we tried to look at stuff, but it was just really.
But it's not published.
These data have been used in other work, and this paper is currently under review. So, yeah. Yes.
The integrated between semantics and phonology.
Mhm.
So when you transition from relying on one keyword to the other, you see a pattern of progressive reliance on phonology when you're switching to the other cluster. So you see the emergence of a lot of reliance on phonological information before the switch. So it's not an immediate transition.
Mhm.
It's before, right?
Yeah, so I mean that's a good point. So we haven't done that level of granular analyses where we can look at just before a switch what kind of cue you're using. What we find is that it's kind of like we were talking earlier, where I was saying that phonology is sometimes like a double agent where like it helps you within a cluster, but a lot of times it takes you to a new cluster. And there you're like, oh, rat, cat, bat, ant. And now you're just in a different cluster and you start using it. So that would be a useful, yeah.
They are usually uncorrelated. So when you see the similarity between phonology and between adjacent items, that tends to be unrelated to the semantics. So when you are relying on phonology, you're not relying on semantics.
Well, I think it's both. No, I think it's they are correlated. Yes.
You still see an influence even diagnosed in semantics.
Yes, yes. So I think most of the behavior is about local use, which means that you're still in the same semantic cluster, but leveraging this additional source. And I think that has something to do with the structure of the language. So it so happens that all the berries have names that, blueberry, raspberry, et cetera, et cetera. So you're still in the cluster, but still leveraging that source in some way. And, yeah.
Curiosity. Did you check word length? Because I remember there was no technical frequency. Right. Meaning between within clusters and
Right. So that data set is quite small. We do see sometimes effects. Word length is interesting. We haven't looked at word length as a function of lexical source, but we have started looking at stems. So, when people latch on to something like berry, what does that mean? And if that's different from other uses of phonology, for example, right? So word length would be another interesting piece to think about.
it's surprising to me because other words are less frequent and they're harder to produce.
Yes. It does happen that people who are producing more items are just doing weird things. So like great white-tailed shark are the kinds of things that you'll see typically. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is about the fluency task.
Mm-hmm.
And you focus mostly, if I got it correctly, on language-related variables. I'm wondering whether there might be some variability in terms of other things that can affect the categories we consider.
In terms of, sorry, I missed some part.
Something more related to those simulational processes that you find in the definition. Because I was wondering, when I'm thinking about classroom, my strategy would be an imagery one.
Yeah.
I think about
Yes.
Yeah. Well, because of the
Yes.
And Like the follow-up question is, you can apply in a measure taken from computer vision, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We were actually just talking earlier how I've been, I feel that a lot of times people are using this mental imagery. A lot of people will say, oh, when you said animals, I thought I was in a zoo. And so I'm walking in a zoo and doing this, right? I've had participants say, I retrieve guidance by thinking about the number of legs that animals have. How do you capture that, right? So I think that's an important piece that we're missing from like the kind of semantics of how this process works. So something to definitely consider, yeah. Especially when also we're thinking about what belongs in a cluster, right? A lot of times it could be motivated by the perceptual similarity of those, yeah.
And, about the cochlear implant, it's a very random thought. Probably it's not. I was thinking you have animals and you have food. And the intuition is that you might have a higher iconicity in animal name than in food names because of onomatopoeia. So the representation, semantic representation of animals in the semantic system might be more auditorily informed and more auditorily connected to the names of the objects. But I'm not sure that this goes along with what you find.
Right.
It goes in the opposite direction.
So I think that might be true, but I almost think that foods, the way that foods are named is because they share stems and share the same root word, it just overtakes this iconicity in the animals. So I think animals is actually one of the categories which has the lowest, smallest effects of phonology that I've shown you. Other beyond, like, so if you think about occupations or food, like you see more of the, like, you know, the same kind of words, ending letters, starting letters coming together more, but yeah.
Yeah, because in terms of systematicity, you would expect words to be more similar to each other.
Exactly.
Iconicity to the verb, actually, because no, I know it's already different.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, I hadn't thought of the other. I mean, this data is just so confusing to me. I was so surprised by what we were finding that we had to reanalyze several times. That are we sure about this? You know. So yeah.
Also, occupation should have a little bit higher systematicity because then again you have this morphological cue, you have teacher, driver, always stronger cue.
Or like all the doctors or the academic, like zoologists, biologists, botanists.
Yeah,
like,
a lot of that. So I was wondering, because one of the things that correct me if I'm wrong, that compared infant cues struggle a lot with morphology, right? I remember having this conversation that there is not with you, yes, but maybe you're more aware of this research than I am, that even high school students still have a lot of issue with morphology, special derivation morphology. So to them, I was talking to a therapist, so this is why it's more anecdotal, but she was collecting some data. And for her, it was like that teacher are more or less the same because they really focus on the stem which is meant to be reached and less on the cues.
Interesting.
Are quite relevant when you're switching from.
Yeah, so that would predict that they produce fewer items for foods,
maybe
more than animal. Actually, that might be true in our data. I don't.
Maybe something the structure of the words and also
like
animals more natural category and food and I don't know.
That might be something to look at. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we haven't done very carefully is, separate the contribution of phonology, morphology, or thought. Like, we're sort of only focusing on phonemes, but there is more that these data could speak to. So that might be something we started looking at stems just recently, but yeah, we haven't done anything systematic yet. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about again the fluency bit and then the relationship with semantics and cognition. And I think one interesting assumption, which to me is an assumption, is that we do activate a specific meaning from which we go to the corresponding label. And this is where my thought switches to computational universal. It is wrong, maybe useful. It could be as well that we activate like a very vague concept for which multiple phonological labels get fit. So the idea is that there is no necessarily such thing as a transition between a semantic process to a phonological one, but just a very vague semantic activation that prompts something phonological, which could be different things. And actually, I think like all the work by Bayern is able to model this pretty well, in the sense that you may have multiple phonological potentially output for a very vague
concept.
Something. So, and I think in principle could account for both things. Of course, there will be like a part of it maybe related to frequency. Also, because you actually activate something specifically because of meaning, but it could as well be that it's just the activation of a cloud that happens to correspond with animals. And then you have open the down to anything phonological that could fit the purpose.
So I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the kind of traditional theories of language production always sort of start with that assumption, right? That like you first activate the semantic layer, and then you sort of retrieve the relevant phonemes, and then you produce a word. I think what some of this work is suggesting is consistent with what you're saying. That like I almost think it might be another level. So not just like, oh, animals is activated and now we're just going to retrieve whatever, but I almost think like it's at the level of local clusters. That like I'm in the cluster of pets, and now I'm going to retrieve everything that's semantic and phonological here, and then move on with a different cue. So it might be a little bit more local, but still like general enough that it can leverage these naturally occurring correlations between semantics and phonology.
Quick follow-up question then. How robust is the opposite effect? So in phonological fluency, do you have some semantic effects?
You do, So I mean that actually is more straightforward. You see, so we haven't done these analyses because we don't have the amount of alpha. I'm less interested in it, but yes, so you do see a lot of like, start with the letter S and it'll be like sun, sunny, sunscreen, and you see those semantic clusters pop out. True, that's true. So there might be, but we do see semantic clusters pop out there too. I don't know if we've done like a very large scale, more systematic analysis of that. But that's really where the inspiration of the project had started when I started my postdoc. Where it was like, oh, we see this in phonemic fluency. What about semantic fluency? And then it led to other things.
Any last question? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.